Hello everyone and happy Halloween. To celebrate, I thought I'd finally take a closer look at a figure that's been sitting on my shelf on my to-do list for some time now, and that is the 14-inch Mego Frankenstein Monster. This is the final entry from Mego's universal line of horror figures in the 14-inch scale. We've had Dracula and the Creature from the Black Lagoon. I've done videos of both of those, so I'll leave a link at the end of this video. To the best of my knowledge, we haven't had any other figures announced in this 14-inch scale, which is a real shame because I would like to see this line continue because I really do like this scale and I really like these universal horror figures in particular. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to this Frankenstein figure. Starting off by looking at the packaging, as we know this is mostly window display, but I do like the consistent theme of green throughout this figure. We can see the inner inlay there. There's not much design on that, but we can see there's like a sort of a deeper green, which is quite nice, which is contrasted against this lighter lime green piping running around the edges of the packaging here. As I said, there's not much else to talk about because this is all about the figure itself in that packaging, but at the bottom there we can see the Frankenstein logo, which is quite nice and fairly nondescript. Likewise, there's not an awful lot going on this side panel here, although we can see in the background there what looks like a production still of Frankenstein's laboratory. It's kind of difficult to tell, but I think that's what they're going for here. That's a little bit inconsistent because we don't really see that on the front of the packaging or the reverse of the packaging, as we'll see in a moment. But what we do see again is that Frankenstein logo at the bottom of this packaging, and we have that again on that side panel there in that piping, which is quite nice. So we can stack these figures up on a shelf. It's probably not going to be the most attractive design really if you look at figures like this, but at least we can see each character individually. And then finally on the reverse we have this fantastic image of Universal's Frankenstein, of course, as played by Boris Karloff. I think this is a wonderful image. They've applied a sort of green filter to this black and white image, which I think works really quite well, and again keeps this packaging fairly consistent with the figure inside. So this looks really, really good. I particularly love how we have the sort of hazy moonlit sky behind him and the mountains there. I think this looks really good and just, yeah, very, very evocative. So this is very displayable. It will certainly draw the eye wherever you place it. So moving on to the figure himself, he is of course in the 14-inch scale, which means he's pretty tall. He'll be bigger than your 1/6 scale figures and certainly bigger than any 12-inch scale figure you have, and that difference will be palpable on your display. This is a brand new head sculpt, sculpted especially for this release. In terms of its likeness to Boris Karloff, I think it's quite good. It's fairly generic. I don't think it's super sharp. In fact, I'd say it's pretty soft in the detail, to be honest. But we can see, like, in terms of the breadth of the nose there, obviously the high forehead and the indentation in the cheekbones. I think certainly it's quite a good likeness in that sense, but as I said, it's just a little bit too soft. I think they've done a good job with the paint apps on one eye in particular. It's got that sort of droopy sense, which is great, but I think it needed a little bit more. Obviously, we've got that cut, that scar at the top of the forehead, and obviously it's just a lick of paint, and I think that would have been looked so much better if they just put a little bit more time and attention, perhaps even sculpted that in to give it a bit more depth and texture. Likewise with the hair is just very flat, it's just painted all one shade. A little bit of a wash running through this, a bit more of sculpted hair quality would have been really nice. And I think it just needed a little bit more shading around the face itself, in particular around those cheekbones there where we have that indentation, just to really, capitalise on this sculpt. So I don't think this is bad by any stretch of the imagination. I think the sculpt is pretty decent. I just think it needed a little bit more enhancement when it came to the paint apps. His clothes are made from a very thin nylon kind of material, so it's a little bit hard to the touch, but it works absolutely fine. I think it's fairly nicely tailored. There's a little bit of detail in here, not that you need an awful lot for Frankenstein. When you open up his jacket, we do have this tunic underneath, which is sort of a tank top, which is quite a nice detail. It's nice that he has his green vest here. I think this is a nice little extra detail that they perhaps didn't need to put in there, but I think it works pretty well and gives the figure a little bit more depth and texture. I also really like that this body has been moulded in this pale lime green colour. I think this works really well for this character and is pretty consistent throughout, so that's a nice touch. When you release the figure from his packaging, you will notice he has these two open, flat palmed hands. These are those kind of reaching hands. They'll be fairly familiar to anyone who's had any other Mego figure in this scale, as they're pretty standard. But again, I think they work pretty well for this particular character because you're going to want to recreate that sort of stumbling pose with his arms outstretched. You'll notice on his trousers there's actually a couple of little rips here and there, which is quite a nice touch. It would have been nice if they'd done a little bit more with this because it's quite subtle, but hey, I appreciate it being there at all. Now, if we look at the trouser leg, if we pull that up, we can see, of course, that there is no socks underneath, and I wouldn't really expect them from Mego, to be fair. He does have these rubber boots, though, which are quite good because he can actually stand fairly comfortably freely in them, and they're fairly solid as well. It's more of a harder plastic than a soft rubber. No real surprises when it comes to articulation. He does have a swivel at the neck there, so his head can rotate all the way around. He's got ball joints in the shoulders, which allow the arms to kick up and out a pretty good distance. And if we roll this sleeve up, we can see that he's got a pin swivel at the elbow, so this lower arm can rotate all the way around, and of course, it can hinge to about 90 degrees as well, which is pretty good stuff. He's got another pin swivel at the wrist, so of course, that hand can rotate 360 degrees, and of course, that also hinges forwards and backwards. He's got a ball joint in the waist. That means he can move from side to side, he can lean from side to side, and of course he can move forwards and backwards a little bit as well, which is absolutely fantastic. So there's actually a pretty healthy dynamic range of motion here, which serves all purposes. Now he's got a hinge in the hips, so his legs can kick out to the side, they can kick forwards, and they kick backwards a little bit as well. He does have double jointed knees though, so he can get that lower leg all the way back there, and there's a final hinge on the ankle to allow that foot to bend forwards and backwards. He also has a handful of accessories, including an extra pair of hands, which are sort of gripping hands, and this chain. Now, I've got to be honest with you, as much as I like having this accessory, this extra chain, I think is a really cool prop for this character, it's kind of redundant because you can't really do very much with it. It is just a loose chain, so there's no cuffs or anything like that, so you can't manicule him, you can't put it around his wrists or anything, which is something they did with the 8-inch scale figure version from Mego. So a real shame that you can't replicate that here, so he does kind of have to just hold it loosely, which doesn't really work. Certainly doesn't work with the open hands, because of course there is that danger that it's going to slide right through them, and he can't really hold it too well with the gripping hand. I mean, the links aren't big enough to slide into his fingers to hold it in place, and yeah, the grip isn't quite tight enough to be able to hold this very thin chain either, so it feels kind of redundant and a little bit disappointing because I feel like they could have done more with this. Generally speaking, I think this figure is a little bit bland. It's lacking a lot of texture and colour that I like to see in my figures. If we compare this, say, to the Creature from the Black Lagoon, which has just so much going on in terms of that costume and the design and just the colours involved in that figure, this figure is obviously a lot more basic and nondescript. Part of that, of course, is because that is how the character is on screen. You know, there's not a lot of details they could have drawn out here, so I think everything really rests on this head sculpt, and although it's not a bad head sculpt, it does feel like it just needed a little bit of something extra, really, a little bit of extra shading perhaps, just to really capitalise on it and just bring this figure to life. So I think this is a bit of a soft release. I don't think it's bad by any stretch of the imagination, and you know, I'm more than happy to have it in my collection, and he's such an iconic character, and it's fantastic to have him in this scale. But I wish they just added a little bit more to him. I think of the three figures, the Dracula and Creature from the Black Lagoon, I think this is probably the most disappointing of the three. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.